we're not short on questions. So I'll try to do my best to summarize these and get to as many of them as I can. And through the Q&A, I'll try to go through kind of the same pattern that we were doing in the talks. So we'll start out with some of the questions about older kids, and then we'll work our way backwards down to some of the questions about younger kids. Obviously, some of them are going to apply to each. And so maybe I'll start out with, it looks like one of the most common questions here for older kids is, what do you do whenever you missed it when they were young, and now you have older kids with all these foundational cracks? How do we fix that? Like, where do we go from there? So y'all have a
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll start out just in the broad picture. For those of you who don't have teenagers yet, your kids are still little, then you want to take the lesson that these are foundational problems. And like Chris was saying, deal with it in the high chair. You want to be pouring that concrete, strong, level, square, when they're little, because that's going to pay huge dividends when they are in the teenage years. For those of you who are already have children in the teenage years, and for whatever reason that foundation wasn't laid when they're little, well, let me encourage you, because God picks you up where you are, not where you should be. He picks you up where you are. There you are. Okay, we go forward from this. There's definitely an age, and it's not defined necessarily rigidly in a numerical way. There's an age where you want to be moving, and you should be able to be moving away from paddling to other forms of discipline. But it's really a case-by-case basis about where exactly that is. And sometimes there's some difference between boys and girls. But the specifics of what you're actually dealing with teens, the devil is always in the details. And that's what we don't have with a hypothetical situation or a hypothetical question. It depends on that child, that boy, that girl. It depends on the situation. It depends on all the details. So, in answering that kind of question, there's not one simple answer, but you need to get advice from your elders, from other mature Christians in your congregation that you can see that they have a lot of wisdom. You see good fruit in their children. You don't have to bring everything to the elders, but basically to help you answer that and to help you see what would be appropriate forms of discipline and of teaching at that age. You're really dealing with a lot of details and specifics which your elders would need to know to help you answer those questions.
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with that. The situations are always going to be peculiar to home and home environment and to the child, which is why it's so important here at King's Congregation that you all develop the sorts of relationships with one another so that you are resources with one another. Hey, let's game this one out, because it's going to have special idiosyncratic ideas to it. One general practical tip is that there does come a time where you move from the artificial consequences or the the more artificial to the less artificial consequences. Eventually, they're going to be in the real world, and the real world is going to give them real world consequences, right? So it's a diminution of artificiality, if you think about it, as the kids get older and more organically connected to behavior. So usually it moves from the rod to a removal of privileges. Removal of privileges, that could be the car keys, that could be certain freedoms that they enjoy, certain gadgets that they might appreciate. They're going to have a season of time without that gadget.
Or additional chores or something like that.
Yeah, sometimes additional chores, although you have to be careful about that. You have to think about, so what if the kid neglects the chores, the additional chores too, thinking ahead. Removal of privileges tends to be much more crisp than additional chores. But something important about that, there was a time when one of our sons got the car privileges removed, and he was on the basketball team, and he needed to get to practice that was before school. All right, and this illustrates something really important, what I was saying about getting back into fellowship, race to fellowship. And like in a spanking liturgy, again, you move from clarifying the offense to administering the rod, and then confession, repentance, that sort of thing. And then forgiveness, the extension of forgiveness, we're forgiven. During that season of time when the privilege is removed, let's just say it's a week, depending on what the circumstances, it's a week, you are for your child. That's not purgatory. That is not like, then you'll be back into fellowship a week from now. No, that your home does not work where you're out of fellowship during the time that this privilege is removed. In fact, we're with you. You don't have access to the car keys. So we'll drive you to basketball practice. We'll help you get around. And it was still a pain in the keister for him not to have access to the car. But we're for him. We're with him now. Like, you've got this hardship that you're enduring. Okay, we're with you in enduring the hardship now. Okay, so you let the consequence fall. But then you help them and coach them how to be faithful when a consequence has fallen, rather than having disfellowship. Disfellowship is never a consequence. So that should be off the table.
Yeah, I think that's really important to catch that those routines that you use with the younger kids, there's adjustments in those as they get older, but those same principles still apply to the routines. And the goal is to get back to fellowship as quick as possible. I think another thing with teenagers that I've thought about a lot is that there's some things that your kids do that might annoy you or that you might not totally agree with, but it's not sinful. Maybe it's the amount of time they spend doing certain things, or maybe they've got a friend that you just don't really like, but you're letting them kind of work through that on their own. Don't use those things as discipline. Like just the things that annoy you. I think one of the challenges or one of the temptations is that that just becomes the privilege you take away every time because you don't like them doing that anyway. Does that make sense? So you want to work through your kid with that on wisdom, but don't just use the opportunity for correction to use that particular thing as discipline.
Yeah, that's the older kids' version of spanking them when you feel like it.
Right.
Yep.
So next question on older kids is, and maybe this goes even older, like how do you parent your kids through, one of the questions here come up a couple times, parenting your kids through courtship and through early years of marriage. Like how involved do you stay with your children through courtship and early years of marriage?
I think one of the biggest things when it comes to courtship with teenagers today, even in good churches, Christian circles, is they need to understand what it really is, because it seems so strange. It seems so foreign. It seems so old-fashioned. And what I found to be the best technique to use to help them understand what it is and why it's wise and biblical, is to take the typical courtship situation and flip it completely upside down. And I've done this in sermons that is directed to teens. And I'm not trying to depress them with an ugly imaginary situation, but I say to them, let's say that one of your parents died. And so you were left with only one parent. It could be your dad, it could be your mom. And let's say that after a little time goes by, your dad, is seeing a woman, or your mom is seeing a man. What is going to be your response as a child of that parent? You could be a teen, you could be 10 years old, you could be 8 years old, you could be 5 years old. And I can tell you what your reaction is going to be because I've seen it many times. Your antennae are going to go up immediately. You're going to be very, very suspicious of this person of the opposite sex who is seeing your father or is seeing your mother. And you're going to instinctively sense that dad should not be doing this alone. I want to know who is this woman? What about her? Is she a Christian? What church does she go to? You're going to be asking all of these questions. And what that shows is that courtship, the principles that are there, the Bible message is that when it comes to the opposite sex, there are powerful unseen forces at work. And one, regardless of age, ought not to go it alone. Because those who are in the wind are not in the best position to harness the wind to make sure that it's going to serve good purposes rather than ill, because the same winds that sail the boat can also wreck the boat. And I've seen situations where you even have a church elder in their 70s, even within our denomination, the CREC, who has been an elder for years, lose their wife of many years, and then afterwards, their kids are grown, but they begin seeing a member of the opposite sex. They get involved in a whirlwind romance, and quickly they are married, and then it turns out to be a disaster. And if you ask their children, they would all tell you, Dad should have involved us. Mom should have involved us and let us help them in this situation. And so I think flipping it upside down that way and letting them see that this is not a matter of age or treating somebody like they're dumb or irresponsible or something like this. I think that helps them understand what it is and why it makes sense and why it's important. And so I think that can be a big game changer for young people when they see it in that light.
So any tips on parenting young married couples that are your kids?
For young, once they're married?
Once they're married, how involved do you stay?
Brenda and I are still working on that. And let me, and to comment on that too, by the way, you never arrive until the Lord calls you home, okay? So when you're single and then, the spouse comes along, you don't have the script for that, and so you have to learn the script. And then the kid comes in, and then more kids, and then the kids, what's it like to leave the home? You know, that every phase of life is a new thing. So Brenda and I are right in the throes of that right now, so it doesn't stop. If you think like, oh, there's some sort of time when the questions will stop. No, they don't. You just get used to life with a bunch of questions and unknowns. That's what you get used to. So, but with the older kids, I will say that we get along wonderfully with our older kids. Our older kids seek out our counsel. We're involved in their lives. There are a couple of son-in-laws who are great, but for the fact that they took our daughters to other cities. But if I could take a moment to underscore something that I said earlier, the relationship you have with your kids as they're having kids, that relationship is really established before they leave your home. And just to reiterate, I was talking about how your kids, when they're still in the home, they have encounters and exposures to their calling and to the world or that sort of thing. And then they come back into the home and then you talk to them about it and you have this relationship where they're dealing with life. And you're involved in their life as they deal with it, as they deal with their comrades on the basketball team, as they deal with the girls at dance class, as they deal with their teachers, they deal with their boss at Qdoba. Our girls worked at Qdoba. We had stuff to talk about with the boss at Qdoba. It's that sort of thing that makes it just pretty natural then, actually to circle back to both parts of the question. So then you're counseling and coaching them as they're forming that attachment. And then once that attachment is formed, and then once kids come, you're involved in their lives and they will seek you out. One thing that is important to recognize in all of that is when you're giving counsel, you have to recognize, though, that it's their child, it's not yours. And so you are in the position of counselor, not nagger, not micromanager, not, because those kids were given to them. And so you need to recognize that the Lord's blessing for them, for your grandchildren, is who the parents are and who the parents aren't. You're not the parents. But you're available, you're a resource, and you're engaged.
And I think there needs to be a big difference between solicited advice and unsolicited advice. Mm-hmm. If they ask you for advice, always give it to them. But if they don't ask you for advice, when they get married, they need to sense that the unsolicited advice is dropping almost to non-existence. They need to sense that they have that freedom and that space because you want them coming to you. If you keep, hands-on, all kinds of unsolicited advice, that's actually going to push them away. You want them to feel that there's this space there where they're free to come to you. And I know it can be different for moms and dads. For me personally, basically, if they want my advice, they're going to have to ask for it. Because I want to create a track record there that if I ever come to them with unsolicited advice, I want that to stand out to them. The only time I would do that is when there's something really important. They're in danger of making a really bad mistake that will pay negative consequences for a long time. And if I give them unsolicited advice, I want it to stand out to them that, Dad never gives us unsolicited advice, so this must be really, really important. I want that to be kind of the context.
Yeah, you need lots of deposits in the bank before you write that check.
Yeah.
One of the ways, and not to belabor this here, one of the ways to develop those deposits in the bank is they're adults, they're skilled and gifted. do you seek their advice for anything? One of my sons is a mechanical engineer. I'm a historian, so I can navigate my way around book lists. But you know, there was a big issue with the automatic garage door, and so I'm like 1-800-SON. Hey, talk to me about this. You know, help me out here. And it's important to model to your kids, especially to the men in the church, to your sons. You know, this is what men do, is they seek counsel and advice, and they surround themselves with this. Sometimes, son, you're my counselor. This is the MO. And so then when you're proximate and available because you're dad, they will draw upon you just as you show respect for them. Remember that respect cannot simply be something that you demand for yourself. It's a gift that's conferred by others, but you need to bestow it.
Yeah, make sure you're opening the door for your older kids to get advice from other wise people around you as well. Make sure you're opening the door for your kids to be able to go to the elders. Make sure you open the door for your daughters to be able to go to other older women in the congregation. Like, make sure that you let your kids know you're comfortable with them doing that, and they ought to be doing things like that. So let's move down to, we've got a lot more questions on older kids. I'm probably not going to get to them, I'm sorry. But let's move down to some of the younger kids. So Dr. Schlecht, in your third session on rules of conduct, you talked about the moment of enforcement being a poor time to lecture the issue and rather address the problem and move on.
Yep.
So what would be the differences in words or actions used to address the problem during enforcement while avoiding the lecturing?
Yeah, the difference is this. Did you hit your sister? Yes. Is that sin? Yes. That covered it? Now, that's not the time to say, why would you do that? How does your sister feel? Now, I don't know, understanding how someone else might feel is actually a human quality that you want to foster in your kids. And so talk about that when it's not the point of enforcement, but that's a good conversation topic to have, and look for opportunities to have that conversation topics, which will be something that you can draw upon when you say, here was an offense. What was the offense? All right, we're going to deal with the offense. The point is to get back into fellowship, not into a system, an ethical treatise. It's not ethical treatise, it's get back into fellowship. And I'd say that's the difference.
Good. So one thing along with the rules, you hear advice, we've heard advice about keeping things simple. Don't be overbearing in your number of rules. Do you guys agree with this? What's some advice on defining household rules?
I think one of the biggest, most important things, and a common theme we see in Scripture, is that everything we're supposed to do in parenting is simply imitating the Father, who is the perfect parent. He displays how he parents his children. He says, when Israel was a child, I called him my son out of Egypt. Paul in the New Testament refers to Israel at the time of the Exodus as being little children. So God displays for us in great detail how he parents. So we want to look at his rules. What kind of house rules did he have for his little kids when he brought them out of Egypt? And the thing is, his house rules were not spot rules. And the way that we tend to do a lot as parents, if we don't think this through and intentionally imitate God, is that all of our rules are spot rules. Stop that. Don't do that. You know, that kind of thing, that it only has an immediate application. The child's really not learning anything from that. God's rules, if you look at them, applied affirmative, ongoing responsibilities on his children so that they had to remember those rules, apply them in the future, and be responsible. So for an example of good house rules for your kids would be things like we do not create unnecessary work for others. If we make a mess, we clean it up. If we take something out, we put it back. You know, those kind of things, you see how that's a rule that's going to apply going into the future. It's always there. It's always the same rule. It always applies. And if you're thinking in those terms, you don't have to have all that many rules before you basically have the basis covered. And if they're engaged in disobedience, it's going to run afoul of one of those rules that are the same rules which they are going to learn because they're not going to change. And so that makes then an easy setup for teaching and for discipline.
Yeah, one way to carry that forward is, how many rules did God give us? Well, he gave us 2, love God, love neighbor. Oh, wait, but he gave us 10. Those 10 are summed up in those 2, the first and second table of the law. But wait a minute, those 10 are fleshed out in the prescriptions that we see throughout Exodus. There are varying levels of detail, granularity, or highly, bigger pixels and smaller pixels. And when your kids are teeny, it needs to be highly pixelated. Don't touch the plug. Did you touch the plug? Yes? All right. SWAT. Pray. You're forgiven. Okay. So it is don't touch. And now how many of those are there? Those will multiply. And as Alan said, this is how the Lord treats Israel when Israel's in its infancy. There's a proliferation of highly pixelated rules, but those are all organically tied to more principles, that sort of thing, that, by the time your children are coming of age as kings and nobility, they're forming the standards themselves and having been shaped by, and there's a relationship between don't touch the power outlet and becoming kings.
Also, God, with his rules in the Old Testament, he says, he's explaining all this in Deuteronomy chapter 8. He says he set up his rules the way he did because he wanted to see what was in his children's hearts. And the way he did that is he gave them an opportunity to succeed or fail. The nature of his rules and the affirmative duties they imposed gave his children an opportunity to succeed or fail, and through that success or failure, God would see what's actually going on in the hearts of his children. It's easy for us as parents to not want to see what's in the heart of our children, right? We don't want to see it. We don't want to deal with it. God was the opposite. He wants to see what's in the heart of his children so that he can parent them in love. And that's by allowing them to succeed or fail. So if you have a rule that when we have a mess, we pick it up, we clean it up, get something out, we put it back, again, a spot way of dealing that would be, don't get that out. I said don't get that out. Now clean that up. But then what do parents often do? They say clean that up, and then the parents clean it up. Or they say, don't touch that, but then they remove the item so the child can't touch it. You see, that's a parent that is not allowing their children to fail. And if you're not allowing them to fail, you're not allowing them to succeed. Now, a good teacher and a good parent allows success or failure because they want their children to have the elation of success and reward for it. Satan wants you to fail. That's a different thing. But that's not why a good teacher gives a test to the students. It's to give them that opportunity to succeed. But if there's an opportunity to succeed, there's also an opportunity to fail. So again, we need to imitate God.
So a lot of questions here on spanking that I want to get to a few of them. So we're kind of running a little bit low on time, but One question on spanking is, you mentioned an objection to spanking, Dr. Schleck, that it didn't work. And what you said, did you seriously expect your child to stop sinning? Well, what's the balance of expecting fruit and, this continual behavior persisting?
Well, if the behavior persists, then spank again. And if the behavior persists, then spank again. You also want to set your kids up for success. Jesus warns about those who lead little ones into temptation. It would be better for them to have a millstone tied around their neck and cast into the sea than leave little ones into temptation. So you don't say you can't touch the power outlet, then you stick the toddler like 6 inches from the power outlet. Okay, right. So understand their frame, but sometimes you might have 17 spankings in a day for the same infraction, and then in the next day, and it's a long game. It probably takes longer and more intervals than you realize. Okay, and so it's going to be exhausting, and you're going to be tempted to despair.
And I think that this where parenting in faith really comes in. Like, how long must I be with you? We really do have to parent in faith, and we really do have to see this young child. I think the direction that both Pastor Allen and Dr. Schleck gave in their talks about continually looking at your children as a future husband and a future father and a future wife and a future mother, like continually keeping that in perspective and keeping the promises of God. If you teach and train your children in the ways of the Lord, when they grow old, they will not depart from it. Like continually parenting in faith.
And I think too, if you take an analogy, let's say we put out a maxim, bathe and you will be clean. And then you have somebody say, I tried it, it doesn't work. It's like you go, well, exactly what are you calling a bath? What did you do? It's like, well, I ran an inch of water in the tub and then I stood in it. It doesn't work. It's like, well, that's not a bath. And so sometimes parents are going, I tried discipline, it doesn't work. It's like, well, what exactly did you do? And then when you start hearing it, it's like, that's not really a biblical paddling. You just aggravated the child. That's all you did.
To take this conversation into another arena that we might be more familiar with. So Pastor Allen stands up in the pulpit and preaches, and suppose there were some in the congregation for whom the conviction of sin did not come upon them. The sermon didn't work. The sermon didn't work. Suppose there's someone who did not come away encouraged. Oh, the sermon didn't work. We don't talk that way about the means of grace, right? Again, it didn't work, that arises from an attitude or a miscategorization of what the rod of correction is about. It's actually like a sermon, and the scriptures describe it that way. Is there a relationship between faithful preaching and a blessed congregation? There is clearly a relationship between that. But then this person's conviction of sin on that particular Sunday, it's not mechanical like that. And when we talk about preaching, I think we theologically can understand that. One of the sources of discouragement and temptations for parents is to not realize that your spanking is a sermon. It's not a mechanism. And it's a sermon that's blessed by God. It's an ordained means that God invests to parents with a blessing that's returning. And so don't let because it's like insert tab A into slot B, when that calculus isn't necessarily working out for you, then repent of that calculus and trust in God and proceed faithfully with the means that He's given you and call on Him to bless those means. That's what you do, rather than getting frustrated that it's not working.
And one thing I would say across the board on this, because we're up here trying to teach, but we're speaking in propositions and so forth. Actually seeing this, the way it works and what the fruit would be in children is what's worth its weight in gold. The thing is, all of our kids are grown. I think Chris and Brenda's youngest is about 24. Our youngest is about 32. And so our kids are not here. You can't see them. You can't see what we were doing. You can't see what the fruit was all the way up. But one of the best things you can do is like look around your congregation. Do you see a younger couple who has kids of your age or maybe a little bit more, and you look at their kids and you go, now that's what we want. That's the fruit that we want in our home. Well, you know what? Go hang around that family. Talk to that young husband and wife. Talk to them about what they are doing. Hang around them so you can actually see them applying the principles with their kids so that you get an organic example of what it looks like. You see, we've lost several generations above us just in terms of the church in general. Because if you come up in a really godly and wise home where your parents are really applying these things, you grow up in that, it's so much easier because you simply start by doing what your parents did. And then you're just adding to the wisdom and the godliness that they had. We have missing generations where we don't have those examples. So look around the congregation, see families that actually got the fruit that you know that you want in your children, and go talk to them and hang around with them and see what it actually looks like.
This is all great advice, and I think one of the best things that can come out of this is that we're asking these questions. We're asking these questions here. We're talking about these things. We're talking about the things, the practical applications of parenting on the ground on a daily basis. And these are all questions that we would ask you guys to continue to bring to us as elders, continue to look to people in the congregation. And I think one of the best things that can come out of this parenting conference is the ongoing conversation. And I actually have all the questions that were asked here, and some of them are more difficult than others, but I'll try to respond to the ones or even get these guys' advice on some of them and respond to them as well. But thank you guys again. Thank both of you. Thank you for coming down this weekend, Chris. It's a huge blessing.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you guys for coming out.